Hello, friends. Gather close and let the noise of the day fall behind you. Tonight, I'll take you on a journey that feels both comforting and just a little strange, like sitting beside a fire and hearing whispers of a world that's half shadow, half memory. The Middle Ages have always been wrapped in mist, filled with stories that sound too wild to be true, yet many of them are. So settle in, because this is no ordinary bedtime tale. This is history that breathes in the dark corners, history that still stirs when the world gets quiet. Before we begin, let's make this moment feel a little more personal. If you're watching right now, I'd love for you to join the circle. Drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're listening from, and tell me the time on your clock as the story begins. It's always a wonder to imagine how many of us, scattered across countries and continents, can share this moment together. One story, unfolding across 1,000 different nights. Some of you are lying down with eyes half closed, some perhaps listening on a walk beneath the stars, and others tucked under warm blankets. However you've arrived here, you're part of this gathering, and if you haven't yet, feel free to tap that little like button, but only if you truly enjoy the slow unraveling of history in this way. Think of it less as clicking something on a screen, and more as adding another candle to the circle of light we're creating together. Each one makes the space just a little warmer, a little cozier. Now, speaking of coziness, let's prepare ourselves. If you have a candle nearby, strike a flame and let it flicker gently. If not, a dim lamp will do just as well. Pull a blanket around your shoulders. Let the rhythm of your breathing slow. Tonight's stories are best heard not in haste, but in stillness, as though we are about to open a door that hasn't been touched in centuries. Behind it are myths, marvels, and strange truths, waiting like forgotten guests at the edge of memory. You see, the medieval world was not just knights and castles, nor was it only plague and war, though there was plenty of both. It was a world where people believed in miracles and curses with the same certainty that we believe in sunrise. It was a place where oddities became legends, where myths sometimes held more truth than they should have, and where human imagination blurred so closely with reality that even scholars today struggle to separate the two. Tonight, we will walk along that blurred line. Think of the tales you've heard, the wild stories that sound like the stuff of fevered dreams, men who howled like animals in the midst of battle, towns where dancing turned deadly, trials where pigs and insects stood accused of crimes, and shadowy figures who may never have existed, but whose names still haunt our imaginations. These are not just curiosities. They are windows into how people once saw the world, and sometimes into how they shaped our world even now. But I won't reveal too much too soon. A good journey should unfold step by step, like a path through a forest where you catch glimpses of shapes in the dark, not yet knowing what they are. That's the mood I invite you into tonight, a little cozy, a little eerie, a little wondrous. And so, let's take the first step together. Let's begin not in the quiet of libraries or the prayers of monasteries, but on the roaring battlefield of the north. There, amid the clash of shields and the cry of steel, lived warriors who fought with such ferocity it seemed as if the wild itself had claimed them. Their enemies swore they felt no pain, no fear, no hesitation. They were men, yet not men, figures half remembered in terror and awe. First, let us meet the Viking berserkers, warriors who fought like they were possessed by the untamed heart of the wilderness itself. Picture a Viking not just swinging an axe, but howling like the wind itself, unstoppable, eyes wide with a fury that seemed to come from somewhere beyond human reason. These were the berserkers, the larger-than-life warriors of Norse legend, men who stepped onto the battlefield as if the laws of fear, pain, and sanity had no hold over them. To their enemies, they must have looked less like soldiers and more like storms in human form, raging forces that tore through shield walls with wild abandon. Imagine the clash of metal, the cries of disciplined warriors holding formation, and then, out of nowhere, a half-naked man in a wolf pelt sprinting at you, foam dripping from his mouth, shrieking like the earth itself had cracked open. They fought in what looked like a trance, immune to pain, blind to fear and deaf to the chaos around them. Swords bit into their flesh, yet they pressed on as though they had forgotten what wounds were. Arrows stuck, axes carved, but the berserker only howled louder, only struck harder. It was said that they felt no fire, no blade, no burden of exhaustion. They charged into battle as if fear had forgotten their name, as if pain had been erased from the world. To the terrified farmers and monks who faced them, these men were nightmares with beating hearts. But here's the thing. For centuries, historians dismissed all of this as exaggeration, the usual medieval flair for drama. After all, the sagas also spoke of dragons, shapeshifters, and men turning into bears mid-fight. Surely this was all metaphor, poetic storytelling passed down around smoky hearths. Scholars thought berserkers were just colorful fiction, characters created to make battles sound grander and victories more impressive. A warrior who fought bravely might, over the decades, transform in the telling into a man possessed, a monster immune to steel. And yet, evidence began to surface that the berserkers might not have been entirely mythical. Archaeological digs unearthed Viking graves where warriors were buried with animal pelts, wolf skins, bear hides, trophies of a wild identity. Coincidence? Perhaps. Or perhaps these men truly cloaked themselves in the spirit of beasts before stepping into battle. Were they channeling animal ferocity? Or were they, in their own strange way, the first cosplayers of history? Picture a battlefield where men dressed as wolves clashed with armored knights. It almost sounds like an ancient comic convention, except with far more blood. Then there are the enemy accounts, not sagas written centuries later, but eyewitness descriptions. They spoke of warriors who bit their shields like rabid dogs, who moved with reckless strength, who could not be stopped by wounds that should have felled any other man. Their eyes burned with something beyond rage, something untamed, unnatural. And here, the story takes a stranger turn. Because scholars began to ask, what could drive a human being to such extremes? What could erase pain, banish fear, and unleash such chaos on command? The clues pointed not only to ritual, but to something consumed. Animal skins were one part of the picture, but deeper in the soil, deeper in the sagas, whispers of another element emerge, something small, red, and spotted, a mushroom that appears in fairy tales, painted in medieval margins, and quite possibly at the heart of berserker madness. So what turned these men into whirlwinds of chaos, half warrior and half beast? Let's talk about a certain mushroom. Meet the red-capped mushroom that looks like it belongs in a fairy tale, but instead fueled Viking rage. Amanita muscaria, the iconic fungus with its bright scarlet dome and scattered white spots, is the kind of thing you'd expect to see painted on the corner of an old storybook illustration, sitting politely beside a gnome. But for the berserkers, it wasn't whimsical decoration. It was fuel, a mind-bending spark that helped turn ordinary warriors into storms of chaos. This mushroom isn't just pretty to look at. Beneath its charming exterior hides a chemical cocktail that does strange things to the human body. Take one bite, and you're not just daydreaming about magical forests. You're sweating, shaking, and trembling with sudden energy. Your sense of pain begins to blur. Fear slips out the back door of your mind, and before you know it, you're ready to wrestle a bear, charge a wall of soldiers, or, at the very least, scream your lungs out at a terrified monk clutching his crucifix. Hallucinations, wild surges of strength, and that frightening inability to feel wounds, all neatly wrapped in the cap of a single mushroom. Of course, the berserkers didn't just pop a mushroom like it was a snack before a raid. They layered ritual on top of ritual, amplifying its effects until the line between man and beast nearly vanished. Imagine them fasting beforehand, emptying their bodies to heighten the mushroom's grip. Add to that rhythmic chanting, drums pounding like the heartbeat of the earth, and perhaps even the swirl of firelight around them. Hunger gnawing at their bellies, poison coursing through their veins, voices rising in a collective howl. What you end up with is not a group of men preparing for battle, but something that feels closer to a cult ceremony designed to birth monsters. Contemporary accounts paint the scene in even darker colors. Enemies of the Vikings wrote of madmen who charged into battle laughing at wounds, grinning as arrows pierced their flesh. They bit into their shields, not for protection, but to control their convulsions, gnashing at the wood like wild dogs. To witness this must have been unnerving beyond description. Warriors who seemed not quite human, who fought with an abandon that suggested possession by the gods, or something far less holy. One monk described them as raging like wolves, another as foaming at the mouth as if stricken with madness. To a frightened villager or a trembling priest, they may as well have been demons. But this wasn't random chaos. Beneath the howls and the frothing mouths lay a kind of brutal efficiency. The berserker's madness worked as a weapon in itself. Terrify your enemies before you strike them, and half the battle is already won. A disciplined shield wall could hold firm against ordinary men, but throw in a screaming figure dressed in a bear pelt, eyes blazing, body impervious to pain, and discipline cracks. The mushroom didn't just fuel madness, it fueled strategy, turning warriors into psychological weapons before the real fight even began. Imagine it now. The sun glinting off blades, the smell of sweat and fear thick in the air, and then, charging toward you, a shirtless Viking, high on mushrooms, howling like a wolf, shield between his teeth, axe swinging wildly. Good luck with that shield wall. A frothing warrior in wolfskin sprints at you, axe raised high, eyes blazing with a madness that makes your blood run cold. Around you, your comrades clutch their shields, the line trembling as it braces for impact. You've trained for battle, drilled in formation, prepared to stand shoulder to shoulder, but nothing in the world could prepare you for this. His scream doesn't sound human. It's raw, guttural, a sound that feels as though it crawled straight out of the wild. Then he slams into the line, and suddenly discipline is no match for chaos. This was the terror of the berserkers. They weren't just warriors, they were nightmares given flesh. One man could scatter many, not always by brute strength, but by the sheer shock of his presence. Imagine standing in a shield wall, heart pounding, sweat dripping, while across the field you see a figure tearing at his own skin, biting into a wooden shield, and charging forward as though the gods themselves had lit a fire inside him. No careful commander's strategy could account for that kind of storm. Fear, after all, spreads faster than steel. A soldier watching one of these howling figures rush the line might falter for only a heartbeat, but in battle, a heartbeat is enough. Shields dip, formations stagger, and what should have been a wall of men becomes a scattering of frightened individuals. Against such a backdrop, the berserkers' fury wasn't just chaos, it was a weaponized form of terror. Even the language they left us is proof of their enduring impact. Today, when someone loses control in a fit of rage, we say they've gone berserk. That word comes directly from these Viking warriors, echoing their madness across centuries. What once described a blood-soaked frenzy on a battlefield now lives in our everyday speech, tossed casually into conversation. Ever yelled at a computer, cursed at traffic, or lost your cool in a way that surprised even you? Congratulations. You've borrowed the spirit of those ancient warriors, though hopefully with less foam at the mouth. Yet for all their ferocity, there's an absurdity in the image too. Picture it again. A man in a bear pelt, high on mushrooms, convulsing, shrieking, and gnawing on his shield. Terrifying, yes, but also undeniably bizarre. To the villagers watching from behind monastery walls, it must have been hard to tell whether they were facing holy terror or simply the strangest spectacle of their lives. Still, absurdity doesn't erase effectiveness. For centuries, enemies remembered them. Sagas preserved their names, and even now we speak of them as if they were half myth, half man. The berserkers lived in the space between legend and history, proving that sometimes the strangest tales carry the sharpest truth, and with that, we leave behind the Viking chaos, those storms of muscle, madness, and myth. Because history has more than one way of turning human fear into spectacle. From wild men howling on battlefields, let's leap forward in time to a city where despair found its release, not through axes and screams, but through endless, unstoppable movement. In 1518, one woman's dance sparked a frenzy that gripped a city. In the sweltering summer of 1518, the streets of Strasbourg shimmered with heat. Dust clung to the air, the kind that sticks to skin and makes every breath feel heavy. In the midst of this oppressive season, one woman, let's call her Elise, stepped out of her home and into the cobbled street. There was no music, no celebration, no festival calling her forth. And yet, she began to dance. At first it looked harmless. Her feet tapped against the stones. Her arms moved in odd, jerky gestures, as if she were following some invisible tune that only she could hear. Hours passed, and still she danced. The sun climbed, dipped, and bled into twilight. And there she was, still moving, her body seemingly possessed by a rhythm that belonged to no band, no fiddler, no drum. Neighbors peeked out of windows, shook their heads, muttered about madness. And yet, they did not stop her. Curiosity turned into fascination, fascination into imitation. By the next day, a handful of onlookers had joined her, their bodies swaying in strange solidarity. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't joyous, it was compulsive, frantic, almost feverish. Like moths circling a flame, people were drawn in, unable or perhaps unwilling to resist the pull of movement. What began as a solitary spectacle soon grew into a gathering, the square filled not with market stalls or town criers, but with dancers. Days rolled by, and what could have been dismissed as the odd behavior of one troubled soul became something far stranger. Dozens now filled the streets, their shoes wearing thin, their bodies weakening, but still, their feet refused to stop. They danced until sweat soaked their clothes, until their legs trembled beneath them, until blisters bled. And yet, the dance went on. Word spread through the city like wildfire. By the week's end, hundreds were moving, jerking, staggering through Strasbourg in a display so eerie, it felt less like a town and more like a stage set for some grim play. Imagine walking to the market, and instead of the usual bustle, you find the streets clogged with people convulsing to no music. Imagine trying to sleep at night, while the sound of dozens of feet stamping the stones echoes through the narrow lanes. What had started with one woman now consumed the city. Families dragged relatives home, only to watch them slip back into the throng. Priests prayed, mothers wept, and still the dancing grew. Unease spread as quickly as the dance itself. Whispers filled taverns and churches. Was this divine punishment, witchcraft, or some unknown sickness of the mind and body? Whatever it was, the spectacle was impossible to ignore. The city was unraveling in rhythm. Strasbourg transformed into a grotesque carnival where the music was silence and the performers could not stop. The leaders of Strasbourg, staring out at this unsettling scene, were faced with a problem unlike any they had ever known. People weren't rioting, they weren't starving in the streets, they weren't attacking one another. They were dancing themselves into exhaustion, into collapse, into death. Something had to be done. And what did the leaders do? Well, you won't believe their solution. Instead of calling for doctors, instead of seeking some practical cure, they leaned into the madness. They called for more music. Faced with a city full of dancers collapsing in the streets, Strasbourg's leaders had a choice to make. They could call in doctors, order fasting and prayer, or perhaps even quarantine the afflicted. Instead, they chose something that feels straight out of a dark comedy. Their solution? If dancing was the problem, then surely the cure was more dancing. Officials went so far as to build a stage right there in the heart of the city, so the afflicted could perform in a kind of organized frenzy. Musicians were hired, pipers and drummers brought in, their task not to soothe, but to intensify the rhythm. Clergy even encouraged the dancers to keep moving, as if exhaustion itself might burn out the strange affliction. Imagine the scene. Pale, staggering figures swaying and jerking on a wooden platform, while a medieval band struck up a tune, the townsfolk watching in uneasy silence. It looked less like a cure, and more like a festival conjured up by madness. The result was as predictable as it was tragic. Spoiler, cranking up the medieval lute didn't stop the madness. it made it worse. The music seemed to validate the compulsion, feeding it, drawing more people into the thrall of the dance. Instead of dwindling, the numbers grew. Where there had been dozens, now hundreds swarmed the squares, hips jerking, feet pounding, arms flailing in desperate rhythm. Far from draining the energy out of the dancers, the spectacle seemed to fuel itself, a grotesque engine running on sweat and misery. And the cost was brutal. Some dancers collapsed from sheer exhaustion, their bodies unable to keep up with the relentless compulsion. Others fell victim to the summer heat, their hearts giving out after days of ceaseless motion. Shoes wore through, feet split open, blood smeared across the stones where they stamped. Neighbors tried to drag loved ones away, but many slipped back into the chaos, compelled by something no one could explain. The cure had become part of the curse. To the people of Strasbourg, the city must have felt bewitched, caught in a nightmare where logic had been tossed aside and only absurdity remained. You could almost pity the officials. They weren't malicious, just unimaginably misguided. Faced with something they couldn't explain, they leaned on the only tool they had: ritual, rhythm, and the hope that more of the same would somehow cancel itself out. Instead, it magnified the disaster, turning the streets into a grotesque parody of celebration, a carnival where the performers were captives of their own bodies. So what exactly happened here? Was this really a case of hundreds of people literally dancing themselves to death, or just a wild medieval exaggeration? Records from the time suggest it was real enough, with priests, clerks, and local leaders all writing of the strange event. But explanations remain elusive, and the truth lies tangled between science and superstition. Two theories stand out, and they're as strange as the dance itself. One of the leading explanations for the strange events in Strasbourg is ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on damp rye, and when consumed, it releases toxic compounds that can trigger convulsions, hallucinations, and a distorted sense of reality. In other words, it's a natural hallucinogen with a nasty bite. Imagine an entire community relying on rye bread during a humid summer, only to discover too late that the grain was laced with something far more sinister than flour. A single meal could twist perception, sending victims into seizures or strange compulsions. It's not hard to picture townsfolk staggering through the streets, driven less by music than by the poisons running through their veins. It would make the dancing plague less a mystery and more a tragic accident of agriculture. But ergot poisoning doesn't explain everything. The dancers didn't just twitch or collapse. They moved with rhythm, sometimes for days, as though caught in an unseen current. Which brings us to another theory: mass psychogenic illness. Put simply, this is when a group of people shares not just ideas, but symptoms, their minds and bodies responding in eerie unison to overwhelming stress. Medieval Europe in 1518 was ripe for such a breakdown. Famine had hollowed bellies, disease haunted doorsteps, and fear of divine punishment simmered in every sermon. Add the heat of summer, the pressure of poverty, and the despair of endless hardship, and you have a city perched on the edge of collective collapse. When one woman stepped into the street and danced, perhaps she gave shape to an anxiety that everyone carried silently. Others joined not because of spores in their bread, but because their minds and bodies mirrored what they saw. The rhythm became contagious. Fear and hope, despair and belief, all fused into motion. In the absence of explanations, the body itself became the language of suffering. And once begun, the dance was nearly impossible to stop. Historical records give weight to this unsettling picture. Church logs, city council notes, and letters from the time confirm that something real unfolded in Strasbourg that summer. These weren't just folk tales spun centuries later. Priests wrote of the afflicted, officials recorded their desperate attempts at cures, and witnesses described the dancers collapsing in the streets. It wasn't a parable meant to warn or inspire. It was a crisis that baffled even those who lived through it. The fact that the event still defies neat explanation only adds to its haunting power. What makes the dancing plague so fascinating and so grim is what it reveals about the human condition. If it was ergot, then nature betrayed the people of Strasbourg. If it was mass psychogenic illness, then despair itself became the poison, turning fear into frenzy. Either way, it shows how fragile we are when pressed by hunger, fear, and hopelessness. Our minds and bodies, so carefully balanced, can tumble into chaos with shocking ease. And when they tumble together, whole communities can collapse into madness. If medieval Europe teaches us anything, it's that despair can turn deadly. The dancing plague wasn't just an oddity, it was a reflection of human vulnerability, an echo of how deeply suffering can shape behavior. Even now, centuries later, the image of a city that danced itself to exhaustion lingers like a nightmare half remembered. And speaking of nightmares, the Middle Ages had no shortage of them. From the streets of Strasbourg, we turn back a few centuries to another unsettling tale. This one didn't begin with a dance, but with a vision. In 1212, a boy's vision sparked a tragic quest, the Children's Crusade. A young shepherd boy, let's call him Theo, stood beneath the wide summer sky and declared that he had seen a vision. According to him, Christ himself had appeared, commanding the impossible, to lead a holy army of children across the land and into Jerusalem, to reclaim the holy city not with swords or spears, but with innocence and unwavering faith. In a world weary of war and heavy with loss from failed crusades, the words of a child carried a strange, irresistible power. Where hardened knights had faltered, perhaps purity could succeed. Theo's call spread quickly, carried by whispers and songs, until it reached villages and towns far beyond his own. Children listened with wide eyes, their hearts swelling with the idea of a divine adventure. To march not as soldiers, but as chosen ones of God. What dream could burn brighter? Parents tried to hush the rumors, but the idea was wildfire. It promised purpose, salvation, and a role in history for those who were usually told they had none. Soon, hundreds began to gather around him. Barefoot boys with nothing but tunics, girls clutching simple crosses carved from wood, peasants' children with little more than their voices. They came not with armor, but with hymns. Their songs rang through the air like the chiming of distant bells, earnest and pure, a sound both beautiful and unsettling. It was faith in its rawest form, too innocent to recognize its own fragility. Parents watched with tears, torn between pride and dread as their children walked away, following a shepherd boy who claimed to carry God's command. As days turned into weeks, the numbers swelled into the thousands. They marched together like a living river of hope, banners of cloth stitched from scraps fluttering in the wind. Passers-by stopped to watch, some kneeling in awe, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Priests blessed them, skeptics muttered warnings, but nothing slowed the tide. It must have been a surreal sight, so many children marching as if their footsteps alone could conquer kingdoms. To them, the journey was not burden, but destiny. Yet even in these early steps, shadows crept along the edges of their path. They had no provisions, no coin, no plan beyond walking until the sea opened or the gates of Jerusalem welcomed them. Some carried only the bread in their hands, others relied on the kindness of strangers. But kindness runs thin when famine already stalks the land. And though their hymns were bright, behind them lingered the questions of worried parents and the muttered doubts of those who had seen crusades end in blood before. Still, Theo's faith was unshakable, and so the march continued. Town after town, field after field, their songs rose against the horizon. From a distance, it must have looked like a pilgrimage of angels. Up close, it was a mixture of ragged clothes, blistered feet, and fragile voices straining to stay strong. Hope carried them forward, but hope was not enough to shield them from hunger, from exhaustion, or from the darker forces waiting to take advantage of their innocence. Barefoot and hopeful, they set off toward a destiny that shimmered like a miracle just out of reach. But what happened next wasn't a fairy tale. Over mountains and through valleys, beneath blazing suns and cold, damp skies, the children walked. Their bare feet blistered and cracked, their songs fading from joyful hymns into weary murmurs. What had begun with shining faces and radiant hope turned quickly into a march of suffering. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, thirst dried their throats, and the weight of exhaustion bent their small frames. Yet still, they pressed on, convinced that their faith alone would carry them across lands and seas to the holy city. Each step was both a prayer and a plea, echoing through the dust of the road. Historical evidence shows that this was no simple legend spun by later storytellers. Church records, letters, and chronicles from the time trace the movement of these children, towns noting their passing like strange processions of pilgrims. Some documents speak of thousands moving together in waves. Others record smaller groups splitting away, struggling toward the same dream. However the numbers are counted, the fact remains. This was no myth. Real boys and girls walked out of their homes and into history, guided by visions and songs, and consumed by a faith too fragile for the world they entered. But reality was harsher than any sermon or vision could prepare them for. Along the march, children collapsed from starvation, some never rising again. The weak fell behind, abandoned by the tide of bodies pressing forward. Disease crept among them, spreading through the weary ranks, and when they finally reached ports, hoping for ships to carry them to Jerusalem, the dream collapsed into betrayal. Merchants promised passage across the sea, but many of these promises were nothing more than traps. Some ships carried children not to the Holy Land, but into slavery, scattering them into markets far from their homes. Others never reached land at all, swallowed by storms, their passengers lost to the depths. The tragedy was staggering. The children had left with hymns on their lips, convinced they carried God's will in their hearts. But the world met them not with miracles, but with cruelty. Their innocence was their only shield, and it shattered against hunger, disease, and human greed. Those who survived carried scars, not just on their bodies, but on their souls. For the parents who never saw their children return, the crusade was not a holy mission, but a nightmare carved into memory. Reflecting on it now, the story feels almost unbearable. Their faith was pure, perhaps purer than any knight who had ever marched with steel and armor. Yet faith alone could not move mountains, nor part seas, nor soften the hearts of men who saw opportunity in desperation. It is a reminder, grim and unshakable, that innocence offers no protection against a cruel world. Dreams, however radiant, can be shattered by hunger and greed. From this human tragedy, where children march toward doom, history takes us on an equally strange but less tragic path. For if the Middle Ages were filled with heartbreak, they were also filled with oddities so bizarre they almost defy belief. And among the strangest of these were trials not for men, but for animals. In medieval France, justice got creative. Picture this: a solemn medieval courtroom, judges in their robes, clerks scribbling furiously, and at the center of it all, a pig. Not roasting on a spit, not wandering through a sty, but standing accused as though it were a hardened criminal. And yes, the pig has a lawyer. Welcome to the strange and bewildering world of animal trials. One of the most infamous cases occurred in 1386 in Falaise, France. A sow was accused of mauling a child, and the townspeople demanded justice. The pig was hauled before the court, formally charged, and subjected to a full trial. Witnesses testified, legal arguments were made, and, unsurprisingly, the verdict did not go in her favor. The pig was sentenced to death and publicly executed, dressed in human clothes for the occasion. It sounds absurd, like a grotesque parody of justice, but to the people of the time, it was deadly serious. And this wasn't an isolated event. Across medieval Europe, animals stood trial for all kinds of alleged crimes. Pigs, cows, goats, horses, even insects were summoned to face charges. Some were accused of theft, others of violence, and in particularly imaginative cases, entire swarms of pests were brought to court for destroying crops. These weren't just summary punishments either. The process mimicked human justice almost exactly. Animals were assigned attorneys to defend them, clerks recorded their cases in detail, and punishments could range from fines to excommunication to execution. Imagine the surreal scene of a donkey with legal representation, or a horde of locusts being solemnly excommunicated by church officials. It's the sort of thing that makes you shake your head and laugh, yet at the same time, you realize that to medieval minds, it wasn't comedy. It was order. Their courts existed to impose structure on the chaos of the world, and if animals disrupted that order, they too had to be held accountable. Justice wasn't just for humans, it was for every creature under heaven. Still, you can't help but marvel at the sheer theatricality of it all. A pig in trousers, standing trial. A swarm of beetles summoned by official decree. Lawyers arguing, with straight faces, on behalf of creatures that could never understand a word of it. It borders on the ridiculous, yet it reveals something strangely earnest about the people of the time. They weren't mocking the law, they were extending it in their own way to the entire natural world. Which brings us to the question, why? Why go through all this effort to try animals as though they were people? The answer lies not in madness, but in mindset. Medieval justice was less about rational categories and more about moral universes. To them, animals were part of God's creation, woven into the same moral fabric as humans. If they committed a crime, it was seen as a breach of divine order, something that had to be addressed through ritual and law. This wasn't madness, it was their sense of order. Picture this: a solemn medieval courtroom, judges in their robes, clerks scribbling furiously, and at the center of it all, a pig. Not roasting on a spit, not wandering through a sty, but standing accused as though it were a hardened criminal. And yes, the pig has a lawyer. Welcome to the strange and bewildering world of animal trials. One of the most infamous cases occurred in 1386 in Falaise, France. A sow was accused of mauling a child, and the townspeople demanded justice. The pig was hauled before the court, formally charged, and subjected to a full trial. Witnesses testified, legal arguments were made, and unsurprisingly, the verdict did not go in her favor. The pig was sentenced to death and publicly executed, dressed in human clothes for the occasion. It sounds absurd, like a grotesque parody of justice, but to the people of the time, it was deadly serious. And this wasn't an isolated event. Across medieval Europe, animals stood trial for all kinds of alleged crimes. Pigs, cows, goats, horses, even insects were summoned to face charges. Some were accused of theft, others of violence, and in particularly imaginative cases, entire swarms of pests were brought to court for destroying crops. These weren't just summary punishments either. The process mimicked human justice almost exactly. Animals were assigned attorneys to defend them. Clerks recorded their cases in detail, and punishments could range from fines to excommunication to execution. Imagine the surreal scene of a donkey with legal representation or a horde of locusts being solemnly excommunicated by church officials. It's the sort of thing that makes you shake your head and laugh, yet at the same time, you realize that to medieval minds, it wasn't comedy. It was order. Their courts existed to impose structure on the chaos of the world, and if animals disrupted that order, they too had to be held accountable. Justice wasn't just for humans, it was for every creature under heaven. Still, you can't help but marvel at the sheer theatricality of it all. A pig in trousers, standing trial. A swarm of beetles summoned by official decree. Lawyers arguing, with straight faces, on behalf of creatures that could never understand a word of it. It borders on the ridiculous, yet it reveals something strangely earnest about the people of the time. They weren't mocking the law, they were extending it in their own way to the entire natural world. Which brings us to the question, why? Why go through all this effort to try animals as though they were people? The answer lies not in madness, but in mindset. Medieval justice was less about rational categories and more about moral universes. To them, animals were part of God's creation, woven into the same moral fabric as humans. If they committed a crime, it was seen as a breach of divine order, something that had to be addressed through ritual and law. This wasn't madness, it was their sense of order. To modern ears, The idea of putting animals on trial sounds like the height of absurdity. But to the medieval mind, it was not a joke. It was an extension of how they understood the world. Animals, they believed, were part of God's moral universe, woven into the same fabric of responsibility that bound humans. If a pig killed a child, or a swarm of insects devoured crops, it wasn't just misfortune. It was a violation of divine order, and violations required judgment. Secular courts and ecclesiastical courts both took up the task. In towns across Europe, pigs that had attacked humans were dragged before secular judges, treated much like rogue citizens who had broken the king's peace. They were tried, sentenced, and punished, sometimes even executed in public, as though making an example of them would deter the rest of the sty. Meanwhile, the church handled cases involving infestations and plagues. If a village found itself overrun by rats, weevils, or locusts, the clergy might convene a formal hearing, summoning the creatures to court through proclamations read aloud. The animals, of course, rarely appeared. That didn't stop the courts from ruling against them. One of the more bizarre cases took place in 1510, when a community sued weevils for eating their crops. Legal representatives were appointed on both sides, the townsfolk to demand protection for their harvest, the weevils to argue for their right to exist. The defense, in a stroke of creativity, suggested relocating the insects to a more suitable area so they might live without harming the villagers' livelihood. Unsurprisingly, the weevils never showed up for their court date, and the ruling was delivered without them. The image of clerics debating the rights of bugs while peasants went hungry captures the blend of seriousness and surrealism that define these trials. As absurd as it all sounds, there was an underlying logic at work. Medieval people saw the world as a hierarchy under God, with humans at the top, but animals still woven into the chain of being. If divine law covered everything, then nothing, not even a beetle, was beyond its reach. Trials, however strange to us, reinforced the belief that the universe had order, that chaos could be addressed with ritual and justice. By prosecuting animals, they weren't indulging in folly. They were affirming their worldview. And in a way, these trials also reflected the limits of human control. A village beset by rats couldn't simply exterminate them with modern poison. A farmer with fields stripped bare by pests had little recourse beyond prayer and symbolic action. So they turned to the tools they had: courts, laws, and rituals. If nothing else, these trials gave people the sense that they were doing something, however futile, to push back against forces larger than themselves. It's easy to laugh at the image of a pig in trousers standing before a judge, or beetles being declared outlaws. Yet behind the comedy lies a certain sincerity. These people were trying, in their own strange way, to make sense of suffering, to impose order on disorder. Their logic may not align with ours, but it was rooted in the same human impulse to seek justice, even when the universe seems unjust. From animals in court, we move to another supposed symbol of medieval brutality, one that, unlike the animal trials, turns out to be pure invention. For centuries, the Iron Maiden has stood as the ultimate emblem of medieval torture, a spiked coffin waiting to embrace the condemned. Now let's debunk a medieval myth that's pure fiction. A spiked coffin of doom, every medieval torturer's dream, right? Wrong. The Iron Maiden, that infamous device with its hinged door and deadly interior of steel spikes, has become a shorthand for the supposed savagery of the Middle Ages. You've seen it in movies, cartoons, even horror novels. A victim shoved inside, impaled on all sides, left to bleed in darkness. It's the kind of image that makes you shudder and mutter, "Ah yes, those brutal medievals." But here's the twist. The Iron Maiden is a fraud. The truth is that no such device ever existed in the Middle Ages. The Iron Maiden was a 19th century invention, stitched together from fragments of old artifacts and a healthy dose of theatrical imagination. Museum curators and showmen pieced it together as a creepy spectacle, eager to entertain crowds with visions of medieval horror. They took an old sarcophagus here, added some spikes there, and voila, the perfect torture machine was born. Not in a dungeon, but in a museum display. Meanwhile, actual medieval torturers didn't need such contraptions. Their methods were far simpler, and arguably more effective. Racks stretched victims until joints cracked, thumb screws crushed digits into pulp, and ropes hoisted bodies into painful suspension. Fire and water, branding irons and whipping posts, these were the real tools of the trade. Brutal, yes, but nothing so theatrical as the Iron Maiden. Why waste time constructing an elaborate coffin of spikes when simpler methods worked just fine? Medieval torturers weren't concerned with horror movie aesthetics. They wanted results, and they got them with terrifying efficiency. So why then has the Iron Maiden become so iconic? Why do we imagine it lurking in every castle dungeon, waiting for the next poor soul to stumble in? The answer lies in the stories we like to tell ourselves about history. The 19th century loved to romanticize the Middle Ages as a time of mystery, superstition, and cruelty. Victorians, in particular, adored turning the past into a Gothic stage, filled with gallows, curses, and spiked coffins. The Iron Maiden was perfect for this narrative, grisly enough to shock, simple enough to understand, and just believable enough to stick. The irony is almost delicious. A device invented to horrify museum-goers ended up shaping how generations think about medieval justice. We remember the fake coffin, but forget the very real racks, screws, and flames that left their mark on countless victims. Our collective imagination favors the Iron Maiden because it feels so medieval, brutal, dramatic, and easy to picture. And that's the real reason the myth endures. It doesn't matter that historians have debunked it time and again. It fits too neatly into our vision of the Middle Ages as a dark carnival of pain. This fake device fits our medieval nightmares perfectly. The Iron Maiden endures in our imagination because it feels medieval, brutal, dramatic, terrifying. Everything we think the so-called Dark Ages should be. A coffin lined with spikes fits neatly into the stereotype of a time we like to imagine as dripping with cruelty and superstition. Never mind that the device never existed in actual dungeons. The image is too perfect to give up. It's history shaped not by truth, but by our hunger for a good story. That hunger was especially strong in the 19th century, when Victorians developed a taste for turning the Middle Ages into a Gothic playground. They adored cathedrals, chivalric tales, and creepy relics of torture and execution. Museums and sideshows catered to this appetite, piecing together half-real, half-invented objects to shock and entertain paying crowds. The Iron Maiden was a curator's dream, a visual horror story in one neat package. Tour guides could point to it, describe prisoners being shut inside, and watch as visitors gasped in fascinated revulsion. Of course, the fact that it was cobbled together from unrelated parts didn't matter much. The truth was less important than the shiver it produced. Audiences wanted confirmation that the past was darker, crueler, more exotic than their present. The Iron Maiden supplied exactly that. It wasn't history, it was theater dressed as history, and people ate it up. The myth survived because it was sticky. It slipped into books, plays, and later films, always as shorthand for medieval brutality. By the time historians stepped in to point out the lack of evidence, it was too late. The Iron Maiden had already taken root in the cultural imagination, and once a story lodges there, facts struggle to pry it loose. Even today, some museums still display reconstructed Iron Maidens, often with small disclaimers hidden away in plaques. The object remains on show not because it's authentic, but because it draws crowds. People don't want to see racks and screws. They want the spiked coffin. There's something telling about our need to keep this myth alive. It reflects how we often treat history not as a record of truth, but as a canvas for our fears and fantasies. We project onto the past what we most want to believe about it, whether that's noble knights and courtly love, or grotesque torture in shadowy dungeons. The Iron Maiden is less an artifact of the Middle Ages, and more an artifact of our obsession with them. And perhaps that's the bigger lesson. The stories that endure aren't always the true ones. They're the ones that satisfy our sense of drama, that give shape to our nightmares or our nostalgia. A spiked coffin captures the imagination more easily than the slow agony of the rack or the dull horror of the thumbscrew. It's clean, theatrical, and instantly chilling. In short, it's perfect storytelling, even if it's terrible history. So the Iron Maiden lives on, not in any medieval court or castle, but in the collective fantasy of what we think the Middle Ages must have been like. It's a reminder that history, in the popular imagination, is as much about stories as it is about facts. From fake torture to another falsehood, let's turn to a myth just as enduring and just as misleading. Did medieval folks really think the world was a pancake? One of the most stubborn misconceptions about the Middle Ages is that people back then thought the earth was flat. The image is almost comical. Peasants terrified of sailing too far lest they tumble off the edge of the world. Priests warning of oceans cascading into the void. It's a picture that fits our stereotype of the so-called Dark Ages as ignorant and unscientific. But here's the truth. Medieval scholars knew perfectly well that the earth was a sphere. The flat earth myth? That was invented much later. Evidence for a round earth had been around for centuries, long before the Middle Ages. The ancient Greeks had already observed that ships disappeared hull first over the horizon, and that the shadow cast by Earth on the moon during an eclipse was always curved. Medieval thinkers inherited this knowledge and didn't toss it aside. In fact, many of them built upon it. Monks, scholars, and even ordinary sailors could see with their own eyes that the world wasn't flat. If you lived near the sea, the daily sight of masts vanishing last was enough proof. So where did the idea come from that medieval people were flat earthers? Enter the 19th century, and particularly a writer named Washington Irving. In his romanticized biography of Christopher Columbus, Irving painted a dramatic scene of scholars and churchmen insisting the earth was flat, with Columbus heroically defying them. It made for a great story. Conflict, courage, the triumph of exploration over ignorance. But it wasn't true. Irving's tale cemented the image of the Middle Ages as an era of backward thinking, and the myth stuck. Historians have been rolling their eyes ever since. The irony is that while we laugh at medieval people for supposedly believing in a flat earth, the joke is on us. We swallowed a 19th century fable and let it shape how we think about an entire era. In reality, medieval scholars like Thomas Aquinas, Roger Bacon, and even countless anonymous clerics were well aware of Earth's roundness. Universities taught it, sailors navigated by it, and mapmakers drew globes long before Columbus ever set sail. The notion of a pancake Earth belongs more to modern imagination than to medieval belief. Acknowledging this truth changes the picture of the Middle Ages. They weren't as ignorant as we like to pretend. Their world was filled with superstition and strange logic, yes, but also with a surprising amount of practical knowledge. They understood astronomy better than many give them credit for, and they preserved and expanded upon the science passed down from antiquity. In short, they didn't think the earth was flat. They thought it was complicated, mysterious, and round. So next time someone sneers about medieval flat earthers, you can thank Washington Irving and his flair for drama. The real Middle Ages had their oddities, but mistaking the shape of the world wasn't one of them. And speaking of oddities, let's turn from cosmic truths to divine justice. Because while medieval scholars knew the earth was a sphere, they also believed guilt and innocence could be tested in ways that defy belief today. Imagine proving your innocence with a scalding cauldron. Justice in the Middle Ages sometimes looked less like reason and more like ritual, and few practices show this better than the trial by ordeal. Imagine standing before a crowd, accused of theft or heresy, and being told that your fate would be decided not by a jury, but by God himself. How? By plunging your hand into a cauldron of boiling water. If the burns healed cleanly, you were innocent. If not, well, that was proof enough of guilt. It sounds brutal, and it was, but to medieval minds it wasn't cruelty. It was divine justice in action. There were several varieties of ordeal, each grim in its own way. The ordeal of hot iron required the accused to carry a red-hot bar of metal for several paces. Afterward, the wound was bound, and after a few days, a priest examined it. A clean healing meant God had intervened on behalf of the innocent. The ordeal of cold water worked in the opposite fashion. The accused was bound and thrown into a pool. If they floated, it meant they had been rejected by the purity of holy water. Guilty. If they sank, they were considered innocent, provided someone pulled them out in time. There were also ordeals by fire, where walking barefoot across glowing embers tested one's righteousness, and even ordeals by food, where swallowing consecrated bread without choking proved your honesty. On the surface, these rituals appear barbaric, but in their own way they were rooted in a consistent logic. Medieval society believed the hand of God touched every corner of life, from harvests to battles to illnesses. Why not justice as well? If human judges could be bribed or misled, divine judgment was seen as the ultimate safeguard. By subjecting the accused to ordeals, communities believed they were placing the matter in God's hands. If the innocent survived unscathed, it was proof of divine protection. If the guilty suffered, it was proof of divine punishment. The psychological effects of such trials cannot be overstated. Many accused individuals, facing the prospect of carrying hot iron or being tossed into icy water, confessed before the ordeal could even begin. The sheer terror of divine judgment combined with very real physical pain was often enough to break them. In this way, ordeals worked as much as tools of intimidation as they did of so-called justice. Even when people endured the tests, interpretation of the results was flexible, often bending to the will of the authorities overseeing the trial. Over time, though, the practice began to falter. By the 13th century, even the Church, which had long sanctioned ordeals, started to view them as excessive and unreliable. As legal systems developed and evidence-based procedures slowly took root, trial by ordeal seemed less like divine judgment and more like unnecessary brutality. Eventually, the Church formally banned clerical involvement, stripping the rituals of their legitimacy. By then, ordeals had become symbols not of divine fairness, but of human desperation, relics of a society struggling to reconcile faith with justice. Still, they left behind a legacy both chilling and strangely fascinating. They remind us that people once lived in a world where the boundary between the sacred and the mundane was paper-thin, where fire and water were believed to speak with God's voice. It is easy to recoil at the cruelty, but harder not to recognize the deep conviction behind it. And so we move from divine justice to a very different legend, one not of fire and water, but of a forest, a bough, and an outlaw who stole from the rich to give to the poor. From the brutality of ordeals, let's step into the greenwood to meet Robin Hood. A green-clad hero lurking in Sherwood Forest, bow in hand, stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. It sounds almost too good to be true, doesn't it? Robin Hood is one of those figures who feels larger than life, a character stitched together from song, story, and centuries of imagination. He's been everything from a noble outlaw to a swashbuckling rogue, the kind of figure you almost wish had walked straight out of legend into reality. But was there really a Robin Hood? The answer, as with so many medieval tales, is both yes and no. The historical roots of Robin Hood are tangled and murky. Records from medieval England mention men with names like Robehod, Hobahod, and other variations, often linked with outlawry or refusal to pay taxes. These may not have been specific individuals, but rather a kind of nickname given to petty criminals who defied authority. Think of it like a medieval alias. If you were a troublemaker in the woods, people might just call you Robin Hood, whether that was your name or not. Over time, these scattered references began to merge in popular memory, coalescing into the figure we recognize today. What's fascinating is how the legend evolved. The earliest Robin Hood ballads don't show him as the charming champion of the poor. Instead, he was a rough, violent outlaw, a man who lived outside the law and wasn't shy about using his bow to make his point. He fought corrupt sheriffs, yes, but he also killed and robbed, often with little remorse. The romance of his story grew later, As ballads softened his edges, and audiences began to imagine him as a noble rebel rather than a ruthless bandit. By the time of Tudor England, Robin Hood was firmly cast as a hero who fought injustice with wit, skill, and a touch of mischief. Then came the real transformation. Literature, stage plays, and eventually films turned Robin Hood into a cultural icon. From swashbuckling Hollywood depictions to the family-friendly Disney fox in green tights, Robin became less outlaw and more idealized hero. The rough bandit of medieval ballads became a figure of fairness and generosity, stealing not just to enrich himself, but to redistribute wealth. He was polished, cleaned up, and handed a cause that matched more modern ideas of justice. Still, behind all the myth and transformation, there's a kernel of truth. Medieval England was rife with discontent, with oppressive taxes, corrupt officials, and vast forests that offered refuge to those desperate or daring enough to defy the law. Whether there was one Robin Hood or many men whose stories blurred together, the legend reflects a very real spirit of resistance. People longed for someone to strike back against injustice, and Robin Hood gave that longing a name, a face, and a bow. So while we may never pin down a single man in green tights who robbed the rich for the poor, the myth endures because it represents something bigger than history. The dream of justice in a world tilted unfairly. Robin Hood is less about fact and more about hope, reshaped across centuries to fit whatever ideals people most wanted to see in him. And speaking of reshaping, let's move from the forest rebel in green to another medieval figure cloaked in mystery. Not a thief or an outlaw, but a knight clad head to toe in black armor. Meet the Black Knight, not a villain, just stylish. When you hear the phrase Black Knight, what comes to mind? Probably some brooding villain from a medieval movie, lurking in the shadows, armor polished to a sinister gleam, ready to challenge the hero in a duel. Pop culture has trained us to see the Black Knight as the classic bad guy, mysterious, menacing, and morally suspect. But the truth is far less dramatic. In reality, a Black Knight wasn't some gothic supervillain at all. More often it was just a knight with dark-colored armor, or in some cases a nickname that stuck. Take Edward of Woodstock, better known as Edward the Black Prince. No, he wasn't an early Batman, and he certainly wasn't skulking around in dungeons plotting evil schemes. He was a celebrated English prince of the 14th century, son of King Edward III, and a formidable commander during the 100 Years' War. His victories at battles like Crécy and Poitiers made him one of the most admired military leaders of his age. The Black Prince nickname. Historians argue it may have come from the color of his armor, or perhaps from the brutality of his campaigns. Either way, it wasn't meant to cast him as a villain. He was royalty, not some wandering nemesis looking to ruin a knight's day. So how did we get from Edward the Black Prince to the sinister pop culture trope of the Black Knight? As with many myths, the answer lies in storytelling. In medieval tournaments and literature, knights in dark armor sometimes appeared as anonymous challengers, figures shrouded in mystery whose identity would only be revealed after combat. This sense of secrecy and theatricality lent itself perfectly to drama. A hero needed an intimidating opponent, and nothing says intimidation quite like a faceless figure in black steel. Fast forward to the age of stage plays, novels, and eventually Hollywood, and the Black Knight became a convenient archetype. The villain dressed in darkness, the shadow to the shining hero in gleaming silver. Movies doubled down on the trope, turning black armor into shorthand for menace. Think of Monty Python's infamous Black Knight, who refuses to admit defeat even as he's hacked limb from limb. Played for laughs, but still reinforcing the idea that black armor equals villainy. In truth, knights of all ranks wore armor of varying shades, depending on the metal, the treatment, or the decoration. Blackened armor, in fact, was often practical, since it resisted rust better and didn't require constant polishing. Some knights may even have chosen dark armor to stand out in battle or tournaments, not to appear evil, but to appear impressive. There's nothing inherently sinister about black steel. It was just another style in the wide fashion catalog of medieval warfare. When you strip away the myth, the Black Knight is less a figure of dread and more a reminder of how storytelling shapes our perceptions. We crave contrast. Good guys in white, bad guys in black. It's simple, effective, and deeply satisfying. But reality is rarely so neat. The Black Knight could be a prince, a hero, or simply a knight who didn't have time to shine his armor. So while Hollywood has given us countless villainous Black Knights, history shows us noblemen, practical fighters, and even princes behind the label. Not quite the menacing archetype we imagine, but perhaps even more interesting for the gap between myth and reality. From armored legends, let's shift to something entirely different: monks with mud on their boots. For our next tale, imagine monks engineering a marvel in a bog, building not just walls of stone, but a community in the middle of a swamp. Welcome to Crowland Abbey. In the middle of a soggy English fen, where the ground squelches under every step, and the mist clings like a second skin, monks decided to build a stone oasis. It sounds impossible. Who would look at a swamp and think, yes, this is the perfect place for a grand abbey? Yet that's exactly what they did at Crowland Abbey, turning inhospitable marshland into a beacon of faith and ingenuity. The challenge was immense. Marshes don't exactly welcome heavy stone structures. They swallow them whole. But the monks were nothing if not resourceful. To create a stable foundation, they drove wooden piles deep into the muck, forming platforms that could bear the abbey's weight. Over this base, they layered gravel paths, walkways, and stone footings. Slowly but surely, what should have been a quagmire became solid ground. The result was a kind of medieval engineering marvel, a place where sacred walls rose above the mist like a miracle carved from mud. And the brilliance didn't stop at the foundations. The monks devised drainage systems to manage the waters of the fen, rerouting streams and carving channels so that their community could survive without being constantly drowned. They turned an environment that repelled most people into one that sustained their way of life. Where others saw only mud and mosquitoes, the monks saw potential for prayer, discipline, and quietude. Why choose such an awkward location in the first place? Partly, it was about isolation. A swamp kept the noise and temptations of the outside world at bay, offering a place of seclusion for prayer and contemplation. But there was also practicality. Marshland wasn't prime real estate. It was cheap, even unwanted, which made it ideal for a community of monks with big ambitions, but limited resources. In their eyes, the swamp wasn't an obstacle. It was an opportunity. The abbey soon became more than a monastic retreat. Pilgrims made their way across the wetlands to marvel at the stone sanctuary standing against all odds. The place gained a reputation for both holiness and ingenuity, a site where spiritual devotion met engineering genius. It was proof that determination and faith could wrest order from chaos, even in the unlikeliest of places. Of course, there's a touch of humor in imagining robed monks trudging through muck, hauling timber, and hammering away at wooden piles while their sandals squelched with every step. It's the kind of image that makes you appreciate their persistence all the more. These weren't just men of prayer, they were builders, problem solvers, and a little bit stubborn. Without that stubbornness, Crowland Abbey would never have risen from the fen. Today, the ruins still stand as a testament to their vision. Even in crumbled form, they tell the story of men who turned swamp into sanctuary, who proved that ingenuity and devotion could literally reshape the landscape. And as wondrous as this tale is, it leads us into another medieval mystery, one far stranger and more controversial. From swamp miracles to whispers of deception at the highest levels of the church, let's ask a question that has intrigued storytellers for centuries. Could a woman have been pope? Let's explore the legend of Pope Joan. A woman disguised as a man, rising through the ranks of the church, and eventually ruling as pope. Wild, right? The legend of Pope Joan has all the makings of a medieval drama. Secrecy, ambition, a shocking reveal, and a scandal so great it supposedly shook Christendom to its core. But was there really a female pope hidden in the annals of history? Or is this just one of those enduring medieval tall tales? The story first appears in chronicles from the 13th century, centuries after Joan supposedly reigned. According to the tale, she was an exceptionally bright young woman who, barred from education because of her gender, disguised herself as a man to pursue knowledge. Under her false identity, she dazzled teachers, gained positions of influence, and eventually climbed the ladder of the church. Finally, she was elected pope, revered for her wisdom and leadership, until, that is, her secret was revealed in spectacular fashion. The most dramatic version of the legend claims her exposure came when she suddenly gave birth during a papal procession. Imagine the shock. The holiest figure in Christendom, carried through the streets, suddenly collapsing in labor. The scandal, so the story goes, was catastrophic. She either died on the spot or was executed, and the church hastily tried to erase all evidence of her existence. But here's where things get tricky. When historians look closely, there's no solid record of a female pope in the official papal lists. There are, however, curious gaps and inconsistencies. Some scholars argue these might be clerical errors, simple mistakes in the copying of papal records. Others, more romantically inclined, suggest these gaps could be evidence of a deliberate cover-up. After all, if the church wanted to erase an embarrassing episode, striking her name from the rolls would be the logical move. Then there's the curious case of the sedia stercoraria, a throne with a suspiciously shaped opening in the seat. Some sources claim it was used to verify the gender of new popes, a ritual in which a cleric would physically confirm the pope's anatomy before declaring, "He is a man." Was this an overreaction to the scandal of Pope Joan, or simply a bizarre medieval rumor retrofitted to support the tale? No one knows for sure, but the very existence of such a rumor shows how deeply the story captured people's imagination. The appeal of Pope Joan's legend lies partly in its audacity. It challenges the strict gender hierarchies of the medieval church, suggesting that brilliance and ambition could outwit even the most rigid systems. Whether she was real or not, Joan represents both a cautionary tale and a fantasy of rebellion. A woman who dared to slip into the corridors of power, if only for a short while. Historians today largely dismiss Pope Joan as fiction, a mix of satire, rumor, and medieval storytelling. But the persistence of her story shows how powerful myths can be. They thrive not because they're true, but because they feel true, or because they express something people long to believe, or to fear. And with that, we leave the mystery of a hidden pope and turn to another medieval tale, this one with darker, more verifiable consequences. From whispered legends of Joan to the downfall of one of the most powerful orders in Christendom, let's step into the shadow of a cursed day. One Friday changed an order forever, Friday the 13th, when the Knights Templar fell. On the morning of October 13th, 1307, the streets of France stirred with an uneasy quiet, a silence that preceded betrayal. King Philip IV, deeply in debt to one of his richest and most powerful allies, the Knights Templar, had made a fateful decision. Instead of honoring the brotherhood of warriors who had defended pilgrims and amassed wealth through banking and land, he turned on them. Across the realm, royal orders were carried out in chilling unison. Templar knights were seized, dragged from their commanderies and locked in cells. The accusations were sensational: heresy, blasphemy, worshipping strange idols, spitting on the cross, obscene initiation rites. To the medieval mind, nothing was more damning. Torture extracted confessions, confessions twisted from pain and fear, the kind that told interrogators exactly what they wanted to hear. The once proud order, clad in white mantles with red crosses, suddenly found itself painted as a hive of corruption and sin. The arrests sent shockwaves through Christendom. At the center of the storm stood Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars. After years of imprisonment and brutal trials, he was led to the stake in Paris in 1314. There, as flames licked at his body, he is said to have spoken a curse, calling upon God to judge the king and the pope who had conspired against his order. According to legend, both men met untimely deaths within a year, fueling whispers that the Templars' vengeance reached from beyond the grave. The downfall of the Templars wasn't just the collapse of a knightly order, it was political theater of the highest order. Philip wanted their wealth, and the Church, under Pope Clement V, was pressured into compliance. What better way to seize power and property than to brand your rivals as heretics? It worked. The Templars were dismantled, their assets absorbed, their reputation forever entangled with mystery. And from that fateful Friday came something more enduring than confiscated treasure: superstition. The mass arrests took place on the 13th day of the month, a Friday already considered unlucky in Christian tradition. Over time, the connection stuck, giving rise to one of the most persistent superstitions we still whisper about today. Friday the 13th as a cursed day. A date that brings dread to calendars around the world traces its roots, at least in part, to the dramatic fall of the Templars. Yet even in ruin, their legacy lingered. Rumors spread that the Templars had hidden their greatest treasures: gold, relics, perhaps even the Holy Grail itself. Their name became a magnet for myths, conspiracy theories, and novels centuries later. The truth of their fate remains simpler: betrayal, greed, and the ruthless politics of kings and popes. From knights betrayed by power to another surprising tale of the Middle Ages, let's turn the page. Because while Templars met their end in fire and intrigue, medieval surgeons were at work saving lives in ways far less brutal than legend would have us believe. When most people picture medieval medicine, the image is usually grim: a bearded man with a rusty saw, chanting prayers while sawing off a limb, or perhaps a doctor in a beaked mask waving herbs at the plague. It's an easy stereotype, but like so many myths about the Middle Ages, it isn't the whole story. The truth is that medieval medicine was surprisingly competent in many areas. Far from perfect, yes, but not nearly as crude as we've been led to believe. Medieval surgeons weren't just hacks with knives. They developed practical techniques that actually worked, some of which sound remarkably modern. Take trepanation, for example, the practice of drilling a hole into the skull. It sounds horrifying, but it wasn't done out of sadism. It was used to relieve pressure from head injuries, and shockingly enough, many patients survived. Archaeological evidence shows skulls with neat, healed edges around those holes, proof that people lived long after the procedure. For all the horror we imagine, these were early, crude forms of neurosurgery. Wound care, too, was often smarter than we give them credit for. Honey, with its natural antibacterial properties, was applied to cuts and gashes. Herbal poultices reduced swelling and infection, and surgeons stitched wounds with surprising precision. Broken bones were set with splints, and amputations, though brutal, were done with an understanding of how to minimize bleeding. Patients sometimes even received wine or opium as crude anesthetics. For people living centuries before germ theory, that's not half bad. Of course, not everything was a medieval medical success story. Bloodletting with leeches was common, based on the idea that balancing the body's humors would restore health. Physicians carried charts showing which vein to open for which illness, a sort of grim, bloody instruction manual. Astrology was often consulted before treatment, meaning your operation might be scheduled not for medical necessity, but because Mars was in the right position. And let's not forget the more bizarre remedies: powdered toad for the plague, or rubbing chicken parts on a wound. Clearly there were limits. But alongside the oddities were innovations worth respecting. Dental work, for instance, included the use of gold wire to secure loose teeth, a far cry from modern braces, but effective enough to keep smiles intact. Eye surgeries, too, were attempted for cataracts, using fine needles to shift the cloudy lens out of the line of vision. These weren't miracle cures, but they show a willingness to experiment, observe, and improve. The biggest myth we need to let go of is the idea that medieval people were helpless victims of ignorance. Yes, their understanding of the body was rooted in theories we now find laughable, like the balance of hot, cold, wet, and dry humors. But within that framework, they managed real successes. They combined practical observation with the spiritual beliefs of their time, creating a system that, while flawed, wasn't devoid of effectiveness. And perhaps the greatest surprise is how much of it overlaps with modern science. Honey as an antibacterial? Still used today. Herbal remedies? Many have been confirmed by pharmaceutical research. Even trepanation has echoes in modern neurosurgery, though thankfully with better tools. The Middle Ages weren't a medical dark age so much as a time of transition, where trial and error slowly pushed medicine forward. So next time someone sneers at medieval doctors, remember, they weren't just waving incense and hoping for miracles. They stitched, splinted, and experimented, and sometimes their patients lived to tell the tale. And speaking of myths, there's another one that needs busting. Were medieval folks really the filthy, unwashed masses of popular imagination? Spoiler, medieval baths were more common than you'd guess. When most of us picture medieval people, we imagine them trudging through mud, covered in grime, smelling like they hadn't seen a bar of soap in their entire lives. In other words, the stereotype paints them as unwashed potatoes with swords. But here's the truth. Medieval folks were a lot cleaner than we give them credit for. In fact, some of their habits would put a few modern, skip-the-shower days to shame. Bathing wasn't some rare luxury reserved for kings and queens. Ordinary townsfolk and villagers often bathed regularly, especially when bathhouses were available. Public bathhouses, much like today's spas, existed in many European cities. Some were simple wooden huts with hot tubs, while others were elaborate stone structures with heated water flowing in. Far from shunning cleanliness, medieval people often sought it out, sometimes even making an evening of it with friends or family. Soap, too, was a familiar friend. Made from animal fats and lye, it may not have smelled like lavender and vanilla, but it got the job done. Wealthier households could afford imported soaps with pleasant scents, while common folk used simpler versions. For those who wanted to take things up a notch, there were perfumed gloves, scented waters, and herbal sachets tucked into clothing to keep everything smelling fresh. Fancy, right? The stereotype of filth really started to stick centuries later, thanks to Renaissance writers and Enlightenment thinkers who loved to sneer at the so-called Dark Ages. To make themselves look more sophisticated, they exaggerated the idea that medieval people were dirty and ignorant. The irony? By the 16th and 17th centuries, many Europeans had actually grown more cautious about bathing, fearing that hot water opened the pores and let in disease. So while Renaissance nobles were dabbing themselves with perfume to mask odors, their medieval ancestors had been soaking in bathhouses with soap. History, as usual, is full of contradictions. Daily hygiene also extended beyond baths. People washed their hands and faces with water, especially before meals, since eating with your hands was the norm. Linen underclothes, worn by many, were changed and washed more often than you'd expect, absorbing sweat and keeping outer garments relatively clean. In monasteries, strict rules required regular bathing and washing, tying cleanliness directly to spiritual discipline. Even peasants, though without the luxury of frequent baths, rinsed and scrubbed when water and time allowed. So no, medieval people weren't the smelly caricatures we've come to imagine. They valued cleanliness, even if their methods looked different from ours. They might not have had electric showers or floral-scented shampoos, but they weren't wallowing in filth either. If anything, the stereotype says more about later propaganda than about medieval reality. And now that we've cleared up the myth of dirty armpits and unwashed hair, it's time to explore another medieval oddity, one that takes us straight from soap and bathhouses to something a little more divine. Imagine being accused of a crime and told your fate would be decided not by a judge, but by a piece of bread. Yes, bread. Holy bread, no less. If you could swallow it without choking, you were innocent. If not, well, let's just say things didn't look good. From clean armpits to consecrated carbs, let's explore the strange ordeal of trial by bread. Imagine standing in a medieval courtroom, the crowd watching, the priest solemnly holding out a piece of consecrated bread. No jury, no cross-examination, just a simple test. If you could eat the bread without choking, you were innocent. But if that holy morsel stuck in your throat, then clearly God himself had judged you guilty. Divine carbs as a justice system. It sounds absurd now, but in the Middle Ages, this was deadly serious. The ordeal of consecrated bread, also called the ordeal of the morsel, was rooted in deep faith in divine intervention. Medieval people believed that God was intimately involved in human affairs, and that he would not allow a liar to profane something as sacred as the Eucharist. The bread wasn't just food, it was holy, infused with spiritual significance. So the logic went, if you had perjured yourself or stood guilty of sin, your own body would betray you. You'd gag, choke, or fail to swallow, exposing your guilt to all. Picture the tension of the moment, the accused, sweating nervously as a hushed crowd leaned in. The priest offers the bread, the accused chews, swallows, or tries to. Every cough or hiccup is scrutinized as divine evidence. Imagine the poor soul who simply had a dry throat that day, suddenly condemned by what might have been nerves or indigestion. A medieval trial was as much theater as it was justice, and this one had all the drama of life, death, and holy bread. On the surface, it seems laughable, but within their worldview, it made sense. In a society where religion explained nearly everything, disease, harvests, even victory in battle, it was logical to believe that God would intervene in matters of guilt and innocence. To them, this wasn't absurd at all. It was proof that truth and justice flowed directly from heaven. In fact, the act of consuming the Eucharist carried so much weight that to do so while guilty was seen as spiritual suicide. Your soul, not just your body, was on the line. Still, like many medieval practices, this one eventually ran into problems. False positives were bound to happen. Innocent people with stage fright, guilty people who managed to swallow without issue. Over time, skepticism grew. Even the church began to question whether bread really made a reliable lie detector. By the Lateran Council in the 13th century, ordeals like this were being phased out, replaced by more conventional legal proceedings. It turns out divine carbs weren't the foolproof justice system people hoped for. Looking back, the ordeal of consecrated bread is one of those moments that makes us chuckle at medieval oddities, but it also reminds us of the depth of their faith. Where we see absurdity, they saw sacred justice. It's a perfect example of how the medieval mind wove the spiritual into the everyday, treating something as ordinary as eating as a direct line to God's judgment. And speaking of judgment and ritual, let's move from bread to brotherhood, from the absurd to the solemn. Because while some medieval trials were laughable to us, others carried an air of deep mystery. Behind the stone walls of Templar fortresses, knights underwent secret initiations filled with silence, vows, and sacred acts. Step into the silent world of the Templars and discover how one became a brother of this legendary order. The dawn is still and pale as a lone knight approaches the fortress gates. He comes without weapons, without armor, stripped of the symbols of war that once defined him. His steps are slow, deliberate, each one carrying him closer to a world he cannot yet see, but already feels pressing down upon him. The air is heavy with silence, broken only by the soft thud of boots on stone. Here, bravado has no place. He is not a warrior now, but a supplicant, humble before something greater than steel or sword. The gates open with a groan, and he steps into shadow. No voices greet him, no words are spoken. Only torchlight flickers along the walls, casting long, uncertain shapes across the ground. The silence itself feels like a command, urging him to quiet his thoughts, to set aside pride, doubt, and fear. Each step deeper into the fortress is a step further away from the world he once knew. He is led to the chapel, its austerity startling in its simplicity. There are no gilded icons or ornate carvings to distract the eyes, only bare stone walls and the faint gleam of relics placed with reverence. A fragment of wood said to be from the true cross, a relic of a saint, perhaps a bone encased in glass. These are the silent witnesses of his surrender. The air smells faintly of wax and incense, yet it is not comforting. It is heavy, almost suffocating, as though the weight of centuries presses down on him here. The knight kneels, his head bowed. The silence is absolute, so deep it seems to pulse in his ears. This is not a place for spectacle or performance. This is a place of stripping away, where worldly honors mean nothing, where wealth and titles dissolve into dust. He has nothing left to offer but himself, and even that must be tested. The brothers watch in silence. Their eyes are unreadable, their faces set. They have walked this path before, shed their former selves, and taken on the mantle of the order. Now they measure him, not by his strength in battle, not by his victories, but by the sincerity of his surrender. For a long moment, it feels as if time itself has paused. He is suspended between worlds, no longer who he was, not yet who he will become. The quiet is unnerving, but also cleansing, stripping him bare before God and his would-be brothers. He senses that this silence is not emptiness, but preparation, the drawing of breath before the plunge. At last, the stillness is broken, not by song, not by prayer, but by a voice. The master of the order steps forward. His words are not shouted, but they cut with the sharpness of a blade. Questions are waiting, questions that will pierce deeper than any sword ever could. Before he joins, he must face a trial of truth. The master's questions cut deeper than any sword. The silence of the chapel deepens as the master steps forward, his presence commanding without needing grandeur. The knight kneels, eyes lowered, heart pounding in his chest. This is no ordinary interrogation. This is the stripping away of illusions, the weighing of a soul. The master's voice, calm yet cutting, fills the room. "Are you free of debts?" he asks. "Do you owe service or promise to another? Have you sworn oaths that bind you still?" Each question is a hammer blow, seeking cracks in the man's resolve. The knight answers, steady but quiet. He knows that even a hint of entanglement, debts unpaid, promises lingering, could bar his entry. For the order demands not half a man, but a whole one. No ties to kings, no secret bargains, no ambitions lurking in the heart. The Templars want men bound to God alone, their loyalties stripped of worldly chains. Then the questions cut deeper. "Are you free of pride?" the master presses. "Do you seek this house for glory, for wealth, for vengeance?" These words linger in the still air. The knight feels the sting, for who among men is truly free of pride? Yet he must answer with the sincerity of one who knows he is about to surrender his life. To falter here, to hesitate even for a breath, would be to betray himself. And hesitation means rejection. If his motives falter, the doors close forever, and he is cast back into the world as though he had never come. The warnings follow, blunt and merciless. Know this: if you join, you will have no ease. You will eat little, sleep little, and fight without rest. You will suffer hunger, cold, hardship, and the certainty of death in battle. Still, do you wish to remain? The knight's throat tightens, for the master offers no illusions. The road ahead is one of endless sacrifice. There will be no wealth, no family, no comforts. Only obedience, poverty, and struggle until the end. The brothers watch, their silence pressing as heavily as the words. The candidate feels the weight of their gaze, men who had made this same choice, who had given up their former lives. He knows they are measuring him, waiting to see if he will falter. One word from him, one sign of doubt, and it will all be over. Yet still, he speaks. His voice is firm, even as his body trembles. He accepts the hunger, the hardship, the death. He accepts the loneliness of the path, the breaking of ties, the extinguishing of self. For in that surrender, he believes, lies something greater. His resolve holds, his answers unbroken, his will laid bare for all to see. The master studies him in silence, then steps back. The questions are done, the trial complete. He has faced the piercing edge of doubt, and he has not turned away. Now comes the true binding, not of words alone, but of vows that will claim his soul. If he stands firm, the real test begins. The vows. Now, he surrenders everything to the order. The air in the chapel thickens as the questioning ends, giving way to the most solemn moment of all. The candidate kneels, head bowed, as the master speaks the words that will reshape his life forever. Here, in this stone chamber lit by flickering torches, he is called to bind himself not by sword or shield, but by vows that will claim his very being. First comes the vow of poverty. The knight is told plainly, he will own nothing, not even the cloak upon his back. Whatever riches he once possessed, land, gold, fine clothes, or horses, are gone from him now. They belong either to his family, to the world he leaves behind, or to the order itself. He is stripped of wealth in every form, made equal to the brother at his side, whether noble-born or commoner. His life will be defined by simplicity, plain garments, shared meals, a cot no better than another's. In this poverty lies freedom, for no worldly treasure can tempt a man who has nothing left to lose. Then comes chastity. The master's voice grows heavier, for this vow severs him from the life of family and legacy. He will never take a wife, never father children, never leave behind heirs to carry his name. His devotion must be absolute, directed only to God and the order's mission. In a world where lineage and inheritance defined a man's worth, this vow cuts to the bone. It demands the sacrifice of not just pleasure, but of continuity itself. His bloodline ends with him, his life consumed entirely in service to a cause greater than himself. Finally, the vow of obedience. Perhaps the most severe of all, it demands that his will no longer belongs to him. From this day onward, every action, every command, every mission is dictated by the order. If he is told to ride into battle, he must ride. If he is told to stay behind in silence, he must obey. Questions are not for him to ask, doubts are not for him to harbor. His freedom is surrendered, replaced by the certainty of duty. It is obedience not just to the master, but to God, whose voice the order claims to serve. As these vows settle upon him, the chapel seems to grow colder. The enormity of what he has surrendered presses down, and yet there is also awe. For in renouncing the world, he has bound himself to something eternal. His life is no longer his own. It is the order's, it is God's, and it is forever. The master pauses, the silence returning, the vows spoken, the sacrifice made. There remains one act to seal them. Not words, not promises, but a ritual binding the soul as surely as chains bind the body. These vows are sealed with a sacred act. He kneels before relics, binding his soul. The chapel is silent, but alive with presence, as the relics are brought forth. They are not displayed with pomp, but with reverence, cradled as though the weight of eternity rests within them. A small reliquary holds what is said to be a splinter of the true cross. Another contains the bones of saints, fragments of lives once burned brightly in devotion. There may be a vial of earth from Jerusalem, dark and ordinary in appearance, yet sacred because of where it came from. To the modern eye, these may seem like simple objects, but to the medieval soul they were windows into heaven, holy witnesses to an oath that no man should dare to break. The candidate kneels before them, his breath shallow, his heart pounding. This is not ceremony for show. This is a covenant carved into eternity. The master gestures, and the knight leans forward. His lips touch the relics, one by one. Each kiss is not affection, but submission, an unspoken pledge that binds his soul more tightly than chains ever could. The splinter of the cross, he kisses, vowing to bear his own cross with obedience. The bones of a saint, he kisses, promising to live and die as steadfastly as they did. Each kiss ties him closer to heaven's cause, as though the saints themselves lean down to witness his vow. The air feels heavier with every act, as if unseen eyes watch from beyond. The brothers stand in silence, their faces solemn. They know the power of this moment, for they themselves once pressed lips to relics and sealed their lives to the order. They know the cost, they know the weight, and they know there is no turning back once the kiss is given. Outsiders in years to come would whisper strange tales of these rites. They would claim the Templars worshipped idols, kissed forbidden images, and or bound themselves in heretical rituals. To those who stood beyond the fortress walls, mystery bred suspicion, and suspicion bred slander. But within these walls, there was nothing but devotion. What outsiders imagined as secret perversion was in truth sacred submission, a knight humbling himself before the holy, binding his soul to the eternal. For the initiate, the act is both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying, because the kiss is a promise he cannot break without damning himself. Liberating, because in that surrender, he lays down the burden of choice. His path is no longer his own. It belongs to God and to the brotherhood. The relics, silent and cold to the touch, seem to burn with unseen fire, branding him not on the skin, but on the soul. When the final relic is kissed, the knight lowers his head, as though the weight of the vows has bent him. Yet in that bowing, there is also exaltation, for he knows he is now a vessel of something greater than himself. He has surrendered his wealth, his desires, his freedom, and now through these relics, he has surrendered even his soul. The ritual nears its culmination. The relics are carried back with the same reverence in which they were brought, and the knight remains where he is, his knees pressed to cold stone, his head bowed low. For now comes the final act of humility, the gesture that seals what words and kisses have begun. Now he kneels, not to man, but to God. One final act of humility seals his fate. The chapel is hushed, the air heavy with wax and incense, as the initiate lowers himself fully to the ground. On both knees, he bends forward, surrendering not just his body, but his entire self. The stone is cold beneath him, and yet it feels fitting, unyielding, eternal. A reminder that his own life is but a fragile vessel compared to the cause he now serves. This kneeling is no casual gesture. It is the burial of the man he was. Here, in the silence of the order's house, his old self dies so that a new brother might rise. Before him stands the master, a figure both stern and paternal. The master does not lift him with words of comfort, nor does he soften the weight of the moment. Instead, he places his hands upon the knight's bowed head, a gesture both solemn and absolute. It is an unspoken seal, a binding of will. The initiate is no longer his own. His obedience is claimed, consecrated, and held fast by the authority of the order. The master's touch is not tender, but it is steady, and in its steadiness lies the final confirmation that the path of surrender is now complete. Around him, the brothers watch in stillness. Their silence is not coldness but recognition. Each of them once knelt where he now kneels. Each of them once shed the last remnants of pride to take up this mantle. Their presence embodies the weight of tradition, the unbroken chain that binds one generation of knights to the next. The initiate feels their judgment, but also their silent welcome, hanging in the balance. In this act of kneeling, all the trappings of his former life dissolve. No lands remain, no titles, no riches, no heirs. The banners he once fought for mean nothing now. His identity is stripped bare until only one thing remains: service. Service to God, to the order, to the cause that binds them together. Kneeling here, he is both smaller than ever before and greater than he could have imagined, for he belongs to something beyond himself. The symbolism is as stark as the stone floor beneath him. To kneel is to surrender, but it is also to rise in a new form. This is rebirth, not in body but in spirit. The man who entered the chapel with doubts and pride is gone. In his place kneels a servant of the temple, a soldier of Christ. The master withdraws his hands, and for a long moment, nothing happens. The initiate remains bowed, caught between past and future, waiting to learn whether he is truly accepted. The silence is unbearable, filled with tension, the weight of judgment pressing from every side. His fate no longer rests in his own hands, it rests in those of the brotherhood that now surrounds him. Now, the brothers decide if he's worthy. Will the knights embrace him as one of their own? The chapel is still, the candidate kneeling in the cold silence, waiting for the decision that will shape the rest of his life. He has spoken his vows, kissed the relics, bowed before the master. Now, everything depends on the judgment of the brothers. No word is spoken. No lengthy debate begins. The ritual is older than memory, and its rules are simple. If any brother believes the candidate unworthy, he must speak. If objections arise, the door closes, and the man is sent back into the world. But if no voice rises, if the silence holds, then his place among them is secured. The silence lingers like a held breath. The initiate feels every heartbeat echoing in his ears. The brothers remain motionless, their gazes steady, their decision unspoken. Seconds feel like hours, the weight of eternity balanced on the absence of sound. At last, the silence itself becomes the verdict. No objection comes. No dissent breaks the air. The brother's stillness is acceptance. In that quiet, he is claimed. The master steps forward and gently raises him to his feet. The candidate is no longer simply a supplicant, but a brother. Yet before this transformation is sealed, one more rite must be completed. A senior knight approaches, his face softened by a rare warmth, and leans close. He places a kiss on the new brother's cheek, a kiss of peace, a gesture of belonging. One after another, the brothers repeat the act, each kiss a bond that ties him more deeply into their fold. No words are needed, for in that simple touch lies a promise. He will never stand alone again. The initiate, who moments ago trembled under judgment, now feels a swelling relief. The kiss of peace is not merely a greeting, it is a recognition that he belongs. It tells him that the trials, the sacrifices, the vows, all have been accepted, and now his burdens are shared. Whatever hardships await him, he will not face them as a solitary man, but as part of a sacred family bound together by faith and purpose. The weight that had pressed so heavily upon him is replaced by a different kind of weight, the strength of unity, the knowledge that his life is no longer his own, but woven into a greater whole. He feels the truth of the vow of obedience settling into him, not as a loss, but as a connection. These men are not strangers now, they are brothers bound tighter than blood. The moment is both solemn and tender. The kisses end, and the silence returns, but it is no longer oppressive. It is a silence of belonging, the quiet of men who do not need to explain themselves because they are understood. For the first time, the initiate stands not as a man seeking entry, but as one who has found it. Yet the ritual is not finished. There remains one last act, a symbol so stark and powerful that it will forever mark the transformation he has undergone. The brothers step back as the master lifts a folded cloak of white. Its fabric is plain, its shape simple, yet its meaning is immense. One final symbol marks his transformation. A white cloak changes him forever. The master unfolds the mantle with deliberate care, and all eyes fix upon it. It is simple in form, woven from plain white cloth, unadorned by gold or embroidery. Yet across the heart is stitched a crimson cross, stark against the pale fabric, glowing in the torchlight as though it had been painted in fresh blood. The initiate watches in silence as the garment is lifted, the weight of its meaning pressing heavier than steel armor ever could. The white speaks of purity, an impossible standard that he must now strive to embody. It is not the purity of perfection, but of sacrifice, the renunciation of self for the sake of something greater. The red cross declares his mission, to shed blood if necessary, his own or his enemies, in service of God and the order. Once he wears this cloak, his life is no longer his own. Every step, every breath, every battle is claimed by the temple. The master drapes the mantle across his shoulders, and in that moment, he feels its chill weight settle upon him. Pride surges within him, pride that he has been chosen, pride that he belongs, but it is tempered by dread. The mantle is not a reward, it is a burden. Its whiteness is a constant reminder that his sins must be washed clean, his deeds without stain. Its cross marks him as a target, an enemy to those who oppose the order, a servant to those who demand obedience. The master's voice cuts through the silence, stern and unyielding. This cloak is your shield, but also your chain. Guard it well, for to betray it is to betray Christ himself. If you fall from the order, if you turn from your vows, this cloak will become your condemnation. It will not protect you but damn you. The words strike hard, and the new brother bows his head, knowing that what he wears is not cloth, but covenant. Around him, the brothers nod, their own mantles flowing like pale waves in the flickering light. He sees in their eyes both pride and warning. They have borne this weight, and they know its cost. Some faces are lined with years of hardship, others young and fierce, but all carry the same mark, the same bond. He is one of them now, bound not by choice alone, but by destiny sealed in cloth and cross. For a long moment, the new knight stands in silence, feeling the mantle rest upon him. It is light to the touch, yet heavy in meaning. He straightens his shoulders, aware that he no longer carries himself as the man who walked into this place, but as one transformed. Then the master gestures, and the brothers turn. The solemnity of the rite softens as they move toward a simple wooden table. Bread, broth, and water await, not a feast, but a meal shared in unity. Now he joins his brothers at a humble table. A shared meal seals his place among them. The ritual of the mantle still lingers in the air as the brothers guide the new knight toward a long wooden table. It is plain and unadorned, its surface scarred from years of use, but it is here that another kind of bond is forged. The smell of warm broth rises, mingling with the faint scent of bread just torn from the oven. There are no silver platters, no roasted meats, no wines to glisten in goblets. Only the simplest of offerings, coarse bread, thin broth, perhaps a little cheese or beans. For men who had given up everything, even food was stripped of excess. The new brother takes his place among them, and for the first time, he does not stand apart. The bread passed to his hands is the same bread every man receives. There are no distinctions of rank or wealth here. Lord and peasant eat side by side, bound by the same vows. The meal itself becomes a quiet proclamation. He is one of them now, equal in sacrifice, equal in service. The act of eating together is far more than sustenance. It mirrors Christ's Last Supper, a moment of fellowship and faith remembered in every bite. Each piece of bread, each sip of broth, is a reminder that they share not only food, but purpose. Their hunger is eased together, their strength renewed together. In a world divided by class and ambition, this table stands as a level ground, a place where no man is greater than another. Yet even here, discipline reigns. The rules are strict, no greed, no excess, no chatter to distract from the solemnity of the moment. Each man eats with quiet reverence, mindful that even the smallest act reflects the order's ideals. To snatch food, to speak out of turn, to indulge beyond what is given, such things would betray the very spirit of humility the mantle demands. Even hunger is subjected to obedience, and the table becomes another battlefield where the soul is tested. The new brother feels the rhythm of the ritual, a prayer before the meal, silence as hands break bread, the quiet sound of chewing that fills the air like a chant of its own. He tastes the rough crust and the plain broth, and though it is simple, it fills him with a strange satisfaction. This is not the feast of a lord, but the meal of a soldier of Christ. To share it is to understand his place, and for the first time since his vows, he feels not just burdened, but comforted. There is warmth here, though it is not indulgent warmth. It is the warmth of unity, of knowing that the men beside him will march with him, fight with him, and, if need be, die with him. This bread is not luxury, but it is communion. It is the daily act that reminds them of who they are and what they serve. When the last crumbs are gone and the bowls emptied, the silence deepens once more. The meal has been eaten, but the rite is not yet complete. The brothers bow their heads together, awaiting the final act that will consecrate the new knight's transformation, binding him forever to the order. One final act consecrates him forever. A prayer seals his eternal bond. The meal has ended, the bowls cleared, and silence settles once again across the hall. The brothers remain seated, heads bowed, waiting for the moment that will seal the initiate's journey. At the far end of the table, the master rises. His presence commands attention without a word, and slowly the brothers lift their eyes. The new knight, mantle still fresh upon his shoulders, lowers his head in anticipation. The master begins to pray, his voice deep and deliberate, carrying across the chamber with a weight that seems to press upon the very walls. He invokes Christ, calling him the eternal captain of their order, and names the saints who gave their lives in sacrifice. He prays for strength, for purity of heart, for the courage to fight without fear and to serve without pride. The words rise like incense, filling the air with a sense of holy gravity. This is no simple blessing. It is the divine stamp upon a vow already spoken, the breath of heaven sealing what man has begun. Yet the prayer is not without warning. The master speaks of betrayal, of the disgrace that falls upon any who turn from their vows. To break faith with the order is not merely to abandon brothers, but to abandon Christ himself. The punishment is not only worldly, but eternal. Damnation, the loss of one's soul, the erasure of every sacrifice made. The weight of the warning falls heavily on the new knight's heart, reminding him that what he has entered cannot be undone without ruin. Still, within the solemnity lies a quiet triumph. The prayer lifts from warning to hope, blessing the new knight with courage and endurance. The master asks that the mantle never weigh him down, but raise him up, that he may live not as an ordinary man, but as a vessel of sacred purpose. The brothers murmur Amen, their voices low but unified, and in that sound the new knight feels himself fully bound to them. He rises from the table no longer a petitioner, no longer a man in waiting, but a Templar. Every step he takes now carries the weight of his vows. He has been stripped of self, remade in obedience, consecrated through ritual, and sealed by blessing. The transformation is complete. Where once he stood as an individual, now he walks as part of an eternal brotherhood, his life interwoven with the destiny of the order. The blessing marks not only an end, but a beginning. The initiate's long passage from uncertainty to belonging has reached its final stage, and now he steps into a life of discipline, sacrifice, and unyielding purpose. He is forever changed. From sacred nights to a city of earthly desires, history turns its gaze elsewhere. The solemn halls of the Templars give way to the vibrant streets of ancient Pompeii, where devotion took a very different form. Let's enter Pompeii's house of pleasure. In the heart of bustling Pompeii, where vendors shouted their wares and chariots rattled down narrow stone streets, stood a building unlike any other. It was not tucked away in shadows, nor whispered about in secrecy. No, this place announced itself boldly, humming with desire as openly as the markets hummed with trade. This was the Lupanar, the city's most famous brothel, and it sat at the very center of Pompeii's pulse. For the Romans, there was no shame in its presence, only business, pleasure, and an unapologetic embrace of appetite. Approaching the building, one would find guidance carved directly into the walls and paving stones. Phallic symbols, etched in stone and painted above doorways, pointed the way as unmistakable markers. Some were crude, others stylized, but all carried the same message: follow the arrows, and you will find what you seek. Romans were never ones for subtlety, and in Pompeii, desire was advertised as plainly as bread or wine. The Lupanar was no hidden den, no place of secret shame. It was central, woven into the daily rhythm of the city. Soldiers on leave, merchants finishing a day of bargaining, even senators traveling through. Anyone might pass through its doors. For Pompeii, the brothel was as much a part of civic life as the baths or amphitheater. Its purpose was practical, transactional, yet surrounded by layers of ritual, graffiti, and art that spoke volumes about Roman culture. Step inside, and the story grows more vivid. The building itself was constructed of solid stone, practical and enduring, like most of Pompeii's architecture. Narrow corridors branched into small rooms, each fitted with little more than a stone bed and a thin mattress of straw. Upstairs, a second floor offered slightly larger chambers for those who could afford a touch more privacy and comfort. But luxury was not the Lupanar's concern. function was. Every wall, every space, was shaped to serve one purpose: transaction. Even before entering the rooms, visitors would encounter frescoes painted above the doorways. These were no abstract decorations. They depicted explicit scenes, painted in bold, unapologetic color. A man and woman in embrace, lovers in various acts. Each fresco acted as a visual menu. Literacy was not required. Anyone could glance at the art and know exactly what was on offer within. It was advertising in its rawest form, practical yet deeply revealing of Rome's unflinching openness towards sex. As one walked deeper, the sounds would have been unmistakable. The shuffle of sandals on stone, the murmur of voices, the laughter of men flushed with wine. The air carried the mix of sweat, oil, and perfume. In those dimly lit rooms, by lamplight and shadow, men from every rank of society sought satisfaction. And while the walls spoke of appetite, they also whispered of exploitation, for the women who worked there were rarely free, their labor bound to the coin that kept the place alive. The Lupanar was more than a building. It was a mirror of Roman society. It revealed a culture where sexuality was commerce, where desire was ordinary, where even walls shouted their purpose without hesitation. Yet beneath the boldness lay the darker truth. Lives spent in service to others' pleasure, carved into history alongside the stones that preserved their world. Its rooms were built for one purpose. The Lupanar was not grand in size, nor luxurious in design, but its architecture revealed everything about its purpose. From the moment one stepped through its entrance, the layout spoke with clarity. This was a place built for business, not leisure. The ground floor opened into narrow corridors, dimly lit by oil lamps that cast long, flickering shadows on the stone. Along these passageways, small rooms branched off, each no larger than a storage closet. Inside, stone platforms served as beds, covered with little more than straw or thin cushions. The walls were close, the ceilings low. Privacy was minimal, and comfort an afterthought. Upstairs, however, told a different story. The second floor contained slightly larger chambers, the kind reserved for men with deeper purses. Here, beds were not carved from stone but framed with wood, sometimes even draped with cloth for a semblance of softness. The light was better, the air less stifling. Yet despite these small touches of refinement, the function remained the same. Whether in the cramped rooms below or the more comfortable spaces above, the purpose never changed. This hierarchy was as pragmatic as it was stark. Wealth bought comfort, nothing more. A poor soldier or laborer might spend his coin in the narrow darkness of the ground floor, while a merchant or visiting dignitary could pay extra for a little more space, a slightly cleaner mattress, perhaps a touch of privacy. But no matter the room, the act was the same. The architecture itself enforced the Roman view of sex as commerce, stripped of sentiment, regulated by coin. Every detail of the design emphasized efficiency. The rooms were small enough to fit many within a compact footprint, maximizing profit. The narrow corridors allowed traffic to flow without congestion, guiding men swiftly in and out. Even the stone beds downstairs, though uncomfortable, were easy to clean and durable against constant use. There was no wasted space, no ornamentation beyond what served a direct function. In every corner, the message was clear. This was a machine built for profit, not pleasure. Yet for all its plainness, the Lupanar had one remarkable feature that elevated it above mere practicality: the walls themselves. Painted in bold strokes of color, they carried frescoes that were as explicit as they were instructive. These were not idle decorations. They were advertisements, images designed to both entice and inform. To step inside the Lupanar was to be greeted not only by architecture of efficiency, but by art that promised satisfaction. The walls themselves sold the experience. Paintings above the doors weren't just art. Step inside the Lupanar, and the walls begin to speak before a single word is exchanged. Painted above the doorways, framed within neat little panels, are frescoes so explicit they leave no room for misunderstanding. Lovers entwined, bodies posed in every imaginable arrangement. scenes painted with a boldness that would make modern blushes bloom. To walk those halls was to browse a catalog in living color, a Roman Yelp for sex, each panel advertising exactly what one could expect within the room it crowned. The purpose of these frescoes was simple, but ingenious. In a city where not everyone could read, images did the work of words. A sailor fresh off the sea, a farmer from the countryside, or a foreign merchant who spoke little Latin, all could understand the message. This was a visual menu, practical and universal. The paintings pointed the way as clearly as any written sign, leaving no room for confusion. Even in the dim light of oil lamps, the colors glowed enough to serve their function. There was no shame in these depictions, no sense that the act should be hidden away. The Romans, for all their sophistication in politics and engineering, approached sex with the same blunt pragmatism they applied to aqueducts and roads. The frescoes were not designed to scandalize, but to inform and perhaps to entertain. Their bold lines and vivid hues carried a strange mix of artistry and commerce, elevating raw transactions into something that felt almost celebratory. Beyond their practical role, the frescoes also held symbolic meaning. In a culture where fertility was tied to prosperity, these images reminded patrons that desire was as natural as harvest or trade. Some scenes leaned toward the playful, others toward the exaggerated, but all carried the same message. This was not sin. This was business, a part of life as ordinary as eating bread or visiting the baths. In their unapologetic openness, the frescoes stripped away the veil of secrecy that later societies would drape over sex. Imagine the effect on a first-time visitor. The doorways themselves became thresholds not just to rooms, but to promises. A man might pause, study a panel, and make his choice as if ordering from a menu. The artwork guided expectations, simplified transactions, and reminded everyone that here, desire was structured, organized, and painted in full view. Yet, for all their boldness, the frescoes also served as a kind of mask. They depicted pleasure with stylized ease, but behind the painted bodies were real women, living lives far removed from the playful scenes. The frescoes told one story, but reality told another. Behind the art were the women who lived this life. Their stories were not painted in color, but etched in stone, scratched into the walls as graffiti, written in their own hands, or in the boasts of the men who visited them. Their stories are etched in stone. The frescoes of the Lupanar may have advertised desire in bold strokes of color, but the true story of the women who lived and worked there was carved in shadows. They were not glamorous figures from painted fantasies, but flesh and blood women, most of them stripped of choice long before they ever stepped into those narrow stone rooms. Many were slaves, captured from distant provinces, Greece, Egypt, Gaul, even beyond the frontiers of the empire. Torn from families and homelands, they were renamed, repurposed, and reduced to property. Whatever identity they once carried was erased, leaving them as commodities in the Roman marketplace of pleasure. Inside the Lupanar, their world was confined to tiny cells barely large enough for the stone bed that dominated the space. The straw-filled cushions offered little comfort, and privacy was non-existent. Day after day, man after man passed through, each encounter blending into the next. The women labored endlessly, their bodies not their own, their wages flowing directly into the pockets of the brothel's owner. The coin that clinked onto the counter never stayed in their hands. For them, survival was the only currency they truly possessed. And yet, even in these harsh conditions, their voices found ways to endure. Scratched into the plaster walls of the Lupanar was graffiti, names, messages, fragments of lives otherwise unrecorded. Some were boasts left by clients, crude affirmations of their conquests, but others carried the imprint of the women themselves. A name here, a declaration there, even the occasional wry remark. These marks, preserved by volcanic ash, remind us that they were not invisible, not entirely silenced by the system that confined them. Their humanity seeped through the cracks, refusing to be erased. It is easy to pity them, and pity is deserved, but it is also important to see the resilience threaded through their existence. They endured, they carved their presence into stone, and they left behind whispers that reach us across 2,000 years. They remind us that even in the most exploitative of circumstances, people fight to be remembered, to leave a trace of themselves. But who kept this place alive? Who ensured the endless stream of coins that bound these women to their labor? The answer lies not in the women, but in the men who visited them. Soldiers on leave, merchants closing a day's trade, travelers pausing in Pompeii on their way to Rome, all crossed the threshold. From slaves to senators, every man in Pompeii found his way to the lupanar, ensuring its rooms never stayed empty for long. From slaves to senators, all visited. Step into the lupanar, and you would quickly see that its doors were open to all. Soldiers fresh from the frontier, still smelling of sweat and iron, clattered in with heavy purses and heavier thirsts. Merchants, their minds buzzing with the day's deals, found their way inside to spend profits in the most immediate of pleasures. Local tradesmen, farmers, and sailors wandered in as casually as if they were heading to the tavern. And yes, even the upper classes, wealthy landowners, visiting elites, perhaps even a senator or two, slipped through those same doors. In the lupanar, social rank melted away. Everyone was a customer, and everyone paid the same coin for the same service. This was part of the Roman paradox, a society fiercely protective of class distinctions in politics and law, yet utterly democratic in its appetites. A poor foot soldier and a wealthy patrician might lie on the same stone bed, served by the same woman, bound by the same transaction. Desire, it seemed, recognized no hierarchy. The walls of the lupanar preserve this truth better than any written record. Graffiti scratched into plaster survives like a chorus of voices echoing across centuries. Some are boastful, crude declarations of conquest. I had her, and she was the best. Others are practical notes, tallying names and prices, as if clients were leaving reviews for the next man. These scribbles read like an ancient TripAdvisor, where satisfaction or disappointment was immortalized for all to see. One man praised his experience with a favorite woman, while another warned of a rival's claim to the same. Even in anonymity, Roman men couldn't resist broadcasting their exploits. But these scratches also reveal the double standard at the heart of Roman sexuality. For men, visiting the lupanar carried no shame. A soldier could boast openly, a merchant could carve his name into the wall, and society would nod in approval, seeing it as natural. Masculinity was measured in appetite and conquest. For women, however, the story was the opposite. Prostitutes bore the weight of infamia, a legal and social stigma that stripped them of honor and respect. They could never escape their role, no matter how many coins they earned for others. The men left graffiti as triumphs. The women were left to endure them. And yet, within these scratches lies more than boasting. Some inscriptions veer into humor, teasing, or even affection. A name carved beside a heart suggests that not all transactions were purely mechanical. Sometimes feelings blurred the edges of commerce. Other graffiti speaks to the sheer diversity of clients. Names from across the empire appear, proof that Pompeii was a crossroads where cultures collided. Soldiers from distant provinces, traders from the east, locals from the Campanian countryside, all left their mark. These walls are more than stone. They are living testimony, filled with laughter, bravado, shame, and fleeting connections. The graffiti transforms the lupanar from a simple brothel into an archive of human voices, preserved under the ash of Vesuvius. Those walls hold more than boasts. They tell stories. The scratches reveal Pompeii's raw voice. The lupanar's walls were more than plaster and paint. They were paper for the people of Pompeii, an open notebook where secrets were carved in broad daylight. The graffiti that covers them is startlingly familiar in tone, a chorus of voices that feels less like ancient history and more like the chatter of a modern comment section. There are boasts, crude jokes, quick insults, and even the occasional flicker of tenderness. One man etched his conquest in bold strokes, bragging for all to see. Another scribbled a clumsy poem, equal parts passion and awkwardness. These weren't polished words meant for eternity, yet by accident of disaster, eternity is exactly what they got. Among the scratches, men's voices dominate, triumphant, careless, sometimes cruel. Yet remarkably, women's voices are there too. A name carved with a heart beside it, likely by one of the prostitutes herself, stands as an act of quiet rebellion. In a world that treated them as property, these women still found ways to declare, "I was here, and I mattered." Each mark, whether etched in jest or defiance, carries the pulse of lives otherwise left invisible in history's official record. What makes this graffiti so compelling is its intimacy. It is not the voice of emperors or senators, but of ordinary people, soldiers on leave, merchants at the end of a long day, sailors between voyages, travelers passing through. Pompeii was a melting pot, and the lupanar captured that cultural mix in its walls. Latin mingled with foreign names, local jokes stood alongside references that only outsiders would understand. The scratches are proof that this brothel wasn't just a local haunt, but a crossroads of the empire, where lives intersected briefly, then vanished, leaving only words behind. And there's humor in abundance. Some graffiti is so crude it could have been lifted straight from a bathroom stall today. Jokes about size, stamina, or the skill of particular women or men litter the walls. Others lean toward wit, mocking fellow clients or spinning puns about love and lust. Through these scribbles, the ancients reveal themselves as startlingly modern, lusty, boastful, and eager to be remembered, even in jest. But beneath the laughter lies a sobering truth. The graffiti wasn't written on neutral walls. It was carved into the very workplace of women who had little say in their fate. Their presence lingers in the names and hearts they scratched, but the overwhelming chorus of male voices reminds us of the imbalance that defined their lives. These writings humanize both sides of the equation, the clients who sought fleeting escape and the women who endured, resisted, and in their own way, left a legacy. The lupanar wasn't just lust, it was business. Every coin spent, every boast carved, fed into a larger machine that kept Pompeii's economy humming. This brothel was a machine of profit. In the bustling streets of Pompeii, the lupanar was more than a place of pleasure. It was a finely tuned machine of profit. At its core, the economics were simple: a coin for a visit. The price was set low enough that soldiers, laborers, and sailors could afford it, ensuring a constant stream of customers. Yet when multiplied by the sheer volume of men who passed through its doors day and night, those small payments transformed into a steady river of wealth. The business model was as pragmatic as any Roman aqueduct, built for efficiency, built to last. But the women who made this machine function never saw the profits. Most of them were slaves, their labor owned outright. Each coin placed on the counter or pressed into a hand was immediately claimed by the brothel's proprietor. These owners, often wealthy citizens or shrewd investors, reaped the benefits of a system designed to exploit the powerless. The women themselves lived on scraps, confined to tiny stone cells, while their bodies filled the coffers of men who might never set foot inside the lupanar. The ripple effect stretched far beyond the brothel's walls. Around the lupanar, secondary businesses thrived. Taverns and wine cellars clustered nearby, ready to loosen purses and tongues before clients entered. Street vendors offered food, trinkets, even garlands of flowers, small luxuries that turned a visit into an outing. Launderers scrubbed garments so patrons could return home without a trace, while moneylenders stood ready to extend a coin or two at interest if desire outpaced a man's means. The brothel didn't just make money. It created an ecosystem of commerce that benefited a wide slice of the city's economy. And it wasn't just Pompeii. Across the Roman Empire, prostitution was legal, regulated, and taxed. Brothels paid fees, owners filed accounts, and the state quietly reaped its share of the profits. In its cold practicality, the empire acknowledged that sex was business. And as with all business, Rome demanded its cut. This level of organization strips away any illusion that the lupanar was a hidden or shameful corner of society. It was embedded into the city's structure, another cog in the grand machine of Roman urban life. Yet, beneath the smooth efficiency of this system lurked a darker truth. The coins that jingled in owners' purses were minted from exploitation. Women were trapped in cycles they could not escape, their identities reduced to entries in a ledger. Their bodies were assets, their suffering invisible in the tidy arithmetic of profit and loss. And still, the system thrived, sustained by demand and protected by law. To the Romans, this was not a moral failing, but a practical reality. Prostitution provided an outlet for male desire, preserved social order by protecting respectable women, and filled the treasury's coffers. It was tolerated, even encouraged, but always with a double edge. The men walked away with no stain on their reputations, while the women bore the lifelong stigma of infamia, stripped of rights and dignity. Sex was legal, but not without shame. Roman morality lived in paradox. On one hand, men indulged freely, slipping through the doors of the lupanar without hesitation, their reputations untouched by the transaction. On the other hand, the women who made that indulgence possible carried a lifetime of stigma. Roman society labeled them infames, a legal category that stripped them of honor, barred them from testifying in court, and denied them the protections granted to other citizens. To sell pleasure was to forfeit dignity, and no matter how many coins passed through their hands, no amount of earnings could buy back their status. It was a system that worked smoothly for men. A soldier could boast of his conquests, a merchant could brag about a night in Pompeii, and an aristocrat could whisper of his adventures without fear of judgment. The burden of shame was placed squarely on the women. Their identities collapsed into their work, their lives recorded only in graffiti and ledgers. The same society that fed hungrily at their doors also condemned them, ensuring that their place remained fixed at the margins. And yet, for all its cruelty, Rome treated prostitution with cold pragmatism. It was legal, regulated, even taxed. The state recognized it as both inevitable and profitable, weaving it into the economic fabric of urban life. To Rome, this was not moral corruption, but an outlet, a safety valve that kept order intact. The contradictions are glaring. A society that celebrated family, virtue, and discipline also built brothels at the heart of its cities and carved phallic symbols into stone streets to point the way. Then came the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, and with it, a moment of eerie preservation. The ash that smothered Pompeii also froze the lupanar in time. Its narrow rooms, its erotic frescoes, its graffiti etched by hands long turned to dust. All remained intact beneath the volcanic shroud. What might have been forgotten, dismissed or erased by history endured instead as one of the most vivid windows into Roman daily life. The irony is sharp. The very place deemed shameful became one of the best preserved records of Roman society. The legacy of the lupanar is not just scandal. It is a mirror of human frailty and complexity. It shows us a society capable of brilliance in engineering and governance, yet willing to exploit its most vulnerable without remorse. It shows us how humor, lust, cruelty, and survival intertwine in ways that feel uncomfortably familiar. The graffiti still makes us laugh, the frescoes still shock us, and the women's faint voices still stir sympathy. The lupanar is not just a brothel in ruins, it is humanity, laid bare. As we reflect on this paradox, we are reminded that history is rarely neat or noble. It is messy, contradictory, and deeply human. The lupanar's walls do not whisper only of sin or shame. They speak of desire, exploitation, resilience, and the timeless dance between what societies condemn and what they secretly embrace. These stories remind us, history's weird, but it's us. Thanks for joining this wild ride. See you next time.